And now it's time for RTB 101. This is the segment where we train you to talk about your faith with friends and family more effectively. Now, the early chapters of Genesis describe people living hundreds of years. These lifespans almost sound fanciful or mythological. So I've asked Dr. Hugh Ross to come talk to us about this issue and answer the question, are long lifespans even scientifically possible?
Well, they are if you've got different physical conditions.
All right.
The physical conditions we have now that limit our lifespan.
All right, well, let's get into that. Let's start, though, with the Bible. Let's start with the early chapters of Genesis. What does the Bible say about these long lifespans? Like, how long were these people living?
800 to 900 years. Now, these are the few people that didn't get murdered by their fellow man. Those that died a natural death lived to be 969 years.
So he's before the flood, before Noah's flood?
Right.
Okay. So they were living hundreds of years before the flood. But then something happens at the flood that shortens the lifespan of humans.
Well, you actually see that in the Genesis 11 genealogy, where the lifespans have an exponential decline down to the present maximum of about 120 years.
Okay. So something happens at the flood that God limits the lifespans? What is that?
Well, I think the fundamental story of these early chapters of Genesis looks what happens when people live a really long time. We all think that living a long time would be great. It's basically telling us we're better off only living 80, 90, 100 years.
Why is that?
Because that's a powerful tool to limit the multiplication of evil.
Oh.
For example, if you allow, say, a serial killer to live 900 years, they can kill off a lot of people.
I could see the problem there.
And explains why murder got out of control in the days before the flood. There wasn't that limitation to stop those kinds of evil acts.
So I'm imagining that some people might ask the question, how do you know that those years, those hundreds of years of lifespans were literal? Like, maybe that was just figurative or poetic.
Well, a lot of scholars look at this and say, maybe we need to divide by a factor of 10 or a factor of 16. But if you do that, that means you've got these patriarchs having children when they're equivalent to 5 or 6 years old. And we know that's not biologically possible. So that's good evidence that from a biblical perspective, these lifespans really were 800 to 900 plus years.
So the view that we hold here at Reasons to Believe is when it says that someone lived 800, 900 years, that's
it's
literal.
Just like our years.
Just like our years.
Correct.
Okay, very good. Now I can imagine that for some of my non-Christian friends, this would present a challenge or an obstacle to them taking the Bible seriously, like thinking about people living 800, 900 years. That just seems kind of odd or not scientifically plausible.
Well, I address this in a chapter in Navigating Genesis, basically making the point in the days before Noah's flood, there was a very different radiation environment for those people. Number one, they weren't exposed to the killer cosmic rays like we are today. A couple of astronomers I cite have basically documented there's been a single nearby supernova eruption that vastly increased the number of fast-moving heavy nuclei cosmic rays. Those are the ones that do you damage. And so people living before the flood wouldn't have been exposed to those killer cosmic rays. Those after the flood would. The other thing we notice is that people before the flood were living in one locale. They weren't global yet, and they were living in a sedimentary plain, and their technology was not yet exploiting igneous rocks. Igneous rocks contain a lot of uranium and thorium. Today, everybody is exposed to those rocks. But in the days before the flood, you'd have humanity isolated from those rocks. So they weren't experiencing the damage from the radioactive decay of uranium and thorium. The other thing you notice, this is in the text, they were on a vegetarian diet. And that's not an issue today because you're not going to live long enough for it to make a difference. But if you're not on a vegetarian diet and you're living 800 or 900 years, you're going to die an earlier death from the accumulation of heavy metals in your body. And the last thing is you need to have telomerase activity at a less aggressive rate. Your chromosomes get shorter and shorter as you get older and older, and that actually protects you from an earlier death from cancer. But if the cancer risk is not high because of the lack of radiation, you could have God build into our DNA a much less aggressive telomerase activity, which would actually allow people to live 800 or 900 years.
So you're speculating some different scientific conditions or conditions of the natural world.
And some of those conditions are not speculative, they're known.
All right.
Because we do know that there is this one supernova remnant that's responsible for these fast-moving heavy nuclei cosmic rays. We know it exploded somewhere between 20 and 100,000 years ago.
Okay.
There's a possibility that that event coincides with the flood of Noah, because the best date we got for Noah's flood is like 40,000 years ago, plus or minus 30,000 years. So if those two dates agree, we got a good concordance.
So if we think about some different physical conditions that might facilitate long lifespans,
Right.
And now we're even in an age where scientists are doing things to actually actively extend the life of humans by changing physical conditions. So that
True.
seems sort of plausible.
True, but there is a limit. Because of our telomerase activity, it's simply not possible for anyone to live beyond about 120 years.
Okay.
The longest recorded lifespan is 122. It's right in line with the biblical limit you see in Genesis 6:3. So definitely I want you to live a healthier life, Krista.
Definitely.
Don't count on going past 120.
Okay, very good. Well, I think this really provokes my thinking of these early chapters of Genesis and some of the challenges that my non-Christian friends bring up. More about that in your book, Navigating Genesis, which should be a good resource for people if they want to continue this conversation.
All of chapter 13 focuses on that issue.
Very good. So I want to let everyone know about that.